Friends, good afternoon. I'm Rabbi Eddie Sukal from the Shul. We gather with Millie and her family to pay tribute to Phil Lipton, beloved husband and father and grandfather, great-grandfather, and a wonderful friend to all of you here. Shiviti Adonai l'negdi tamid ki mini bal emot. Lachen sameach libi v'agel kevodi af besari yishkon lavetach. Ki lo ta'azov nafshi lishol. Lo titen chasidcha lerot shachat. Todi'eni orech hayim sfas machot et panecha ne'imot b'yamincha netzach. I have set the eternal always before me. God is at my side. I shall not be moved. And therefore, my heart exults and my soul rejoices. My being is secure. For I know that you will not abandon me to death, O God, nor will you let your faithful one see destruction. You show me the path of life. Your presence brings fullness of joy. Enduring happiness is your gift. Those words from the 16th Psalm are traditionally included, as I have, often as an opening to a funeral service. And it's paradoxical because it speaks of exulting heart and joy, enduring happiness, when in fact the mood is exactly the opposite today. And so we have to ask, why has our tradition assigned these particular verses from the 16th Psalm to a funeral service, a memorial? And it's exactly because of the paradox that we begin this way. Because we remind ourselves that though this is a time of grief and a time of mourning, these are days of tears and sadness. Despite that, this is also a time of great gratitude. That's the challenge of grief, to grieve fully and also to be grateful for the gift of Phil's life. That was so much. And his life wasn't only long-lived, that's important, but a long life that's miserable, that's not much of a life at all. Phil's life, totally the other direction. Filled with joy. I first met Phil in 1995. And the way I remember him, because this is how I saw him the first day I met him, and every time after that, and it was hundreds of times, with a big smiling face. And it wasn't just the size of that smile and the beauty of that grin. It was so warm. He was so warm and welcoming, and he just brought people into his orbit. Even if your car was running correctly, he would still like you. And so here we are, grief and gratitude. And we do speak of joy and happiness because that was the nature of Phil's life. It was a life of joy. It was a life of happiness. Millie, you were teenagers when you met. Young teens, actually, before you were even dating. You told me there was a boys' club and a girls' club. And you all weren't driving yet. You were too young to drive. But little by little, year by year, you all got older and eventually were old enough to drive, and the guys began to get cars. and you would get together, the boys group and the girls group. Nobody's asking what you did, but you would get together. And then you told me something funny. At the end of the evening, the guys would give each other rides home, and the girls had to find their own way home. They hadn't fully woken up, but somewhere along the way, you and Phil, you woke up. And you began a romance. And it turned into a love affair. And you said it yourself, from that point on, you were never really separated. You were always together. Millie and Phil, Phil and Millie, it's the same thing. We read this from the book of Psalms. The days of our years are 70, or perhaps by reason of strength 80 years. And yet 1,000 years in God's sight is but as yesterday when it is past. And here's the essential message of this psalm. Teach us therefore to number our days, that we may attain a heart of wisdom. And may your favor, O God, be upon us. Establish the work of our hands, that it may long endure. And particularly for a guy like Phil, who worked with his hands, worked with his brain also, let's be clear about that, but who had magnificent hands, not only, by the way, to fix cars, but also to play the violin. Two very different sets of skills, but both involving the hands. Establish the work of our hands, that it may long endure. And in the way Phil lived, the work of his hands indeed will long endure. I have more I want to say, but before I do, I want to call upon some family members to share some memories and reflections as well as a prayer. I'd like to begin by calling Lori.
Hi. Thank you all for coming to honor the life of my father. His full name, Philip Wolf Lipton, and I just always thought that was the coolest name. He was not only my father, but the father of me and my 3 sisters. And so he was our father, our hero, and our role model. You may know him as a vintage car collector, and we all know Dad loved his cars. But Dad's greatest collection was people. I don't believe he ever made a friend that he didn't keep. There are so many friends, I can't mention them all, but one example is Larry Axelrod and his wife Bee. They were Boy Scouts together. They learned about cars and girls together. They raised their families and worked together. And Larry even told me the other day that my father taught him how to drive. There's a story, well, there are lots of stories. In this story, my dad was driving and he noticed some other poor soul in his mind lost a wheel. And kind of chuckling and saying, oh my gosh, those people lost a wheel. Well, he brought his car to a stop and the front end fell. And he realized it was his wheel. And my father laughed very hard every time he told us that story. There were so many families we were merged with. Though my father was an only child, you would have never known it. His first cousins, Phil, Teddy, and Mel, Mel's here somewhere, there's Mel, were like his brothers. And there was many other alliances with many other families, like the Kaspars, the Knightuses, the Zemmels, the Skolnicks. There's just so many, I can't even think to mention them all. Dad and Mom, they were married when they were 21. Well, Mom was almost 21. There's some story I can't quite put together about my grandfather. My mom's dad was supposed to do something, but he thought they were old enough that they could handle it or something. It's been a fabulous marriage for my parents. I traveled with my mom and dad, 8-10 years ago, to New York for my cousin, their great niece, Jessica, and Jessica's here, for her wedding. And we're going to the hotel, and my dad's putting the key in the door, and my mom is like this. Phil, a little higher. I go, Mom, give him some space. And he looked over his shoulder at me and gently corrected me, and he said, I'd miss her if she wasn't there. He was such a loving husband. On June 15th, it would have been 72 years. He's the father of 4 daughters, and oh, how he loved his girls. He was an amazing father. 4 girls, but yet he made each one of us feel like we were Daddy's little girl. Most of us call him Daddy all the time, so we never grew out of calling him Daddy. Mom will tell you there was one rule at the dinner table: no crying. I'm like, really? 4 girls going through puberty? You think you're going to accomplish that? Well, as you can imagine, there was plenty of crying, but you had to go to your room to do it. And after dinner, my father would come, and he would sit at the foot of your bed and wait till you were ready to tell him what was the matter. He'd listen, and he'd do what he could to make you feel better. My younger sister, well, she reminded me that he would wait for us to settle down. When it came to discipline, he was firm but gentle. I can remember staying out too late. Can you imagine me doing that? And instead of him grounding me, my father told me how it made him feel. Needless to say, I grounded myself. Dad had such an outgoing and fun personality. He loved to tell jokes, especially dirty ones. So back in the day before, cell phones and technology, we had dial-up phones, and Dad got a hold of this joke, and I think he called everyone he knew with this one. I'm going to clean it up a little bit, but he'd call and the other guy'd say hello, and Dad said, what has a 1/4-inch winky and hangs down? And he'd wait. A bat. Then he'd say, what has a 12-inch winky and hangs up? Click! And laugh, and just couldn't wait to find the next man to call to prank. Dad was my hero. He would always be working in the garage, so he'd either be at work working on cars, or he'd be at home pulling side jobs or fixing up some kind of junker to resell. One time, I was being pulled in a wagon by the next-door neighbor who was like my brother, Seth, and I was telling Seth to go faster, and then I guess I told Seth to stop, so he did, and I came right out of that wagon. My dad flew out of that garage, jumped over, we had new sod, jumped over all the, how they used to tie the string around to protect the lawn, jumped over all of that and came and scooped me up and made sure I was okay. Another time, because he was always in the garage, I would hang out with him, and I was playing on Lisa's tricycle, and I was too big for it, and I fell into a tray that he had like battery acid or something. He was cleaning car parts in, and I fell into that vat of acid, and before I even knew it, my dad had me up in the bathtub just dousing me with water so that nothing would happen to me. So he just was always there to make sure that his girls didn't get hurt. When it came to cars, Dad always had the fix. Mechanics from all over would call him for advice. He wrote many articles, and as teenagers, all my sisters and I, we couldn't wait to be 16. As soon as we were allowed to take our driver's license tests and classes and stuff, we were right on it. Cars were my dad's passion. The car shows, the car clubs, Dad always had something on his agenda. You guys probably all know the 61 red Impala convertible. one of his prides and joy. He also had a 35 Chevy Coupe. The 61 convertible was invited to Chevrolet's 100th anniversary. They had 2 cars per year, and Dad was so proud to be in that parade. It was also in the closing of the Cleveland Stadium and the opening of Jacobs Stadium. Both times he got to drive Bob Feller. And his 35 coupe was in the opening of the movie The Christmas Story. When it came time for our dates to start coming around to see me and my sisters, we'd have to compete for attention with Dad because the men would meet Dad and the car talk and the world talk and all this stuff would start happening, and we'd have to, vie for some attention. Hey, you came to see me. Back when home theaters and computers were science fiction, Dad would entertain us with long country drives in his convertible. In the 60s and 70s, it was a Pacific Mist blue convertible, and he made a drive out to Chagrin Falls feel like a day trip. Carrie reminded me also that each summer, the family of 6 was loaded up in the car and off to Cedar Point for some family fun. There was one condition, though. When we got to the park, we had to go to the beach with Dad for an hour. It seemed like torture, as we all couldn't wait to get on the roller coasters. In his later years, with some health conditions and stuff, started slowing him down, and his memory, shall we say, was selective. He would tell healthcare workers that he was fine. He just took the family to Cedar Point. He rode his bike around the block. He just went swimming. Everything's fine. We called it his happy place and let him live with his happy memories. My baby sis, Lisi, she was the caretaker from heaven. Dad never complained. He was very strong, but with age, he needed some assistance. When he needed something, he would just call out, "Hello, hello," which sometimes was annoying, but we're sure going to miss that call. Lisa would appear. If I would step in and try and help, he'd say, "Get Lisa. She's good at this." My nephews, Jordan and Brandon, were never far away, and were always, we're more than willing to lead adventures. You guys have all probably seen on Facebook the family parade. So we had 2, one on a scooter, one in a wheelchair, and the rest of us, cat and dog, because the cat follows us. And we'd go around the block or up to Acacia. My nieces, Amy and Jody, are here from Texas, and they brought so much joy. Between them, they have 5 children, which are my dad's great-grandchildren, and they always made time to call and spend, do video calls and stuff with Grandpa. And then Rachel and Brett, my other niece and nephew, are here, and they were always at the house. We will miss him more than words can express. Our love for our father goes on and on. He taught and inspired us. His love for his family, his religion, his cars, and I have to say people, because look at all these lovely people. Most of you have met Dad and spent time with him, and he always had a joke. He loved his daughters, grandkids, and grandchildren, and all of you, and we thank you so much for being here to share this with us.
Lori, thank you.
Thank you.
Tradition teaches words that come from the heart enter directly into the heart. Thank you. I'd like to call Sherry to come forward, and joining her will be Rachel.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is my beautiful daughter, Rachel, to just give me some moral support. Who was Phil Lipton? He loved his cars, and he also loved Playboy magazine. A year's subscription was often given to him as a birthday or Father's Day gift. Once he was done reading that month's edition, Dad, after getting permission from Al Kaspar, thank you, Lori, would have Jeff Kaspar, the oldest boy, come over, raise his right hand while he put his other hand, his left hand, on the magazine and state, "I solemnly swear I will not look at the centerfold." When Jeff went off to college, his younger brother Seth, who was also like our brothers, but he was more than happy to take over that ritual. Dad was too. Mom and Dad grew up in what was then known as the Kinsman area of Cleveland. It was a fairly tight-knit Jewish area, and most of the people there knew each other. A teacher by the name of Seymour Levine was one such resident. He taught at Charles F. Brush High School. Both Carrie and I had him as a high school English teacher at one point or another. I'm not sure if Lori had him, but I don't think Lisa did. And he gave his students an assignment. I can't remember what it was all about, but when he read one of our papers that we had submitted, he knew right away whose daughter we were. Immediately he knew. See, my father had changed his last name at some point before we were ever born. You see, he had quoted an article that had been published in Playboy magazine. Mr. Levine knew because he also was a regular reader of that magazine.
Just for the articles.
Yeah, that's what he always said. That was our dad. He loved dogs. Every dog that we ever owned loved Monday evenings. Dad always brought home a steak bone from the Schwitz. Somehow, the dogs knew it was Monday, and at around 9 p.m., they would start pacing around the house, waiting for Daddy to come home. We even thought they could smell the garlic as soon as he turned off of Richmond Road. Daddy learned to swim in that ice-cold, small pool when he had finished learning to walk. His mother would take her with him every Wednesday on Ladies' Day, when he was a baby even. Cars. He loved his 35 coupe and later his Chevy convertible. When he first bought the 35, his dream was to restore it to its original condition. Frank and I helped him. We sanded, we primed it, and we painted it Brainerd blue. I'll never forget the name of that color. One of the last things it needed was the correct radiator cap. One was finally found and ordered. Unfortunately, it was very close to a regional car meet that was somewhere in Illinois. The timing would be close, but we ordered it anyways and kept our fingers crossed. Dad and Mom were at the meet when it showed up on a Friday, right before the day before the show. Frank and I drove all night to bring that to him. He won first place in his class for the first time at that show. Sorry. He was so proud. Okay. One thing that Daddy hated was the bitter cold Cleveland winters. Whenever the subject of shoveling the driveway came up, his outlook was, God put it there, he'll take it away. That was Daddy. As much as he hated the winter, if anyone needed help, He was the first person to be called, and he never said no. I recall when Lisa first started going to school in Toledo for college, she was heading back to campus on a very, very snowy, cold night, and her car broke down at about 2 in the morning. Without a moment's hesitation, Daddy got dressed, loaded some tools in the trunk of his car, and headed west to get her back on the road. I tagged along with him in case I could be of any help to either one of them and to keep Daddy company during the drive. The whole way there, all he said was, when one of my girls needs me, I'll always be there for her, whether she likes it or not. That was just Daddy. And another time, he got a call very late at night from the Pennsylvania Highway Patrol. There was a couple who were close friends of some of their other friends. They had gotten lost. This couple had gotten lost, and they were found kind of wandering around, I think, eastern PA, and they were wandering around like kind of aimlessly. The officers could tell that something was wrong, and so they got a couple to pull over, and who could they call, to help them and come and get them and everything. So the couple could only think of Daddy. And when they were asked who to call, Daddy knew this couple, but he and Mom, Daddy hardly, excuse me, I need to read my own thing. Daddy hardly knew this couple, but he and Mom went to get them and bring them home safely to their family. And it turns out both of those people were in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease and shouldn't have been driving anymore. But that was just Dad. All you had to do was say, I need, and he was there. Thank you all for coming.
I don't have anything written, but when I didn't have anyone there while Mom and Dad were separated, Papa was always there for me. And I will never forget him or the joy he brought to this world. Thank you all for being here.
And I'd like to ask Carrie to come forward.
Hi, I'm Carrie, or as my dad called me, number 1. Sherry was number 2. Lori was number 3. And then Lisa was number 4. That was how he could keep us straight. He wouldn't always get their names right, but it'd be number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. The love between my mom and my dad is unbelievable. From the minute his friend, can I name you? Larry had a date with my mom, and Larry was unable to drive after the party they were at. And my dad took Larry home, sent him home, and then he went and took my mom home as a courtesy, and that's when they started dating. So thank you, Larry. My dad was so devoted to my mom. They were married 72 years. And I've never seen a relationship like that. Anybody to have such a relationship is blessed. My dad used to like to drive. Cars were his life, and he used to drive as a race car driver, and go to the drag strip or whatever. And my mom got very nervous and got very scared and was worried about him, and he just stopped. No fight. I wasn't there yet, but I'm assuming there was no. If I was little. But he just stopped because he didn't like to cause my mom stress. And he was always there for her, and, he would do things that she liked, and she would do things that he liked, just because that's what you do in a marriage, and you support each other. And he never disagreed with her. If we were teenagers and we were fighting about something, he would always say, listen to your mother. He always stood by her side, supported her, and was always there for her. Just like my other sister said, Millie and Phil and Millie, they were almost always together. I was looking through a bunch of pictures to try and find pictures of my dad, and whenever I saw a picture of him, 90% of the time, my mom was right there with him. Sometimes he'd be with one of his daughters or his grandchild, but one of his grandchildren, but mostly it was him and my mom. And you almost never saw one without the other. They were almost never. I think that I was in my 40s before my parents ever spent a night apart. I think they came down when I had a baby or something. I don't remember, but that was like the first time my mom spent the night without my dad when he couldn't get away. So they were very devoted to each other, and he was a good husband, a good father. He was the best. He was loyal. He was a proud Jew. He had personal opinions about certain things, like he didn't like certain brands here because they were owned by German companies. He was very outspoken. He was a very pro-union guy, of course, being a mechanic, but and he was a really good man, and that's it. And we all loved him.
I'd like to call forward the three grandsons, Brett, Brandon, and Jordan.
My grandpa took me to 25, maybe 30 Hershey's, and it was a yearly occasion, always looking forward to it. Later on, my father came with us, my cousin Jordan several times, and Brandon once, but he's not into the swap meets. He loved his cars and his friends, but mostly his family. I also took the Playboy oath. Totally broke it, shattered it, threw it out the window when I was 14 or 15. And prior to that, I think I smuggled a couple home before I took the oath. He was one of the best men I was ever. Him and my Uncle Dan were my main male role models growing up, so this is extra hard because Uncle Dan's been gone 13 years. But my dad's here for me now. I see him in the audience. I have a prayer that we read at temple every 2-3 times a month. Eli, Eli, O Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand in the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. The sand in the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, and the prayer of the heart. And my heart will always be with my Sadie. Thank you for all coming. We'll see you at the Shiva, we'll see you in the funeral home, and only good stories.
So, of course, as all of us here know, my Grandpa Phil was a wonderful, extraordinarily kind, and intelligent man. I feel so fortunate that he was able to live such a long and eventful life. I'm reminded of a quote that I randomly stumbled across on the internet some years ago. When an old man passes away, a library burns to the ground. And boy, what a library my grandfather was. Full of stories. Stories like feeding the emperor's horse during his travels in Korea and Japan when he was drafted in the Korean War, during which, perhaps by a stroke of luck, he successfully managed to avoid the front lines as a rifleman by changing the flat tire on one of the colonel's vehicles, which then resulted in him joining the motor pool as a mechanic instead. Stories like getting his hair cut from his old barber Angelo, He told me that his barbershop had even been written about in the paper, claiming it was a local mob hangout spot. So much so that Angela would jokingly pick up the phone when it rang and greet the caller with, "Hello, Mafia." Stories from the Schwitz, one of his all-time favorite places. He'd relax in the steam room with his buddies and then have himself a delicious steak or swordfish topped with tons of garlic. Stories about all of his friends. He always loved telling us about his one buddy, Gary Halford. He was the senior resident scientist at NASA, and Grandpa said that Gary told him that he was smarter than most of the guys that he worked with. Stories about all the cars he's owned over the years, all the car shows he's attended and won trophies from, and about how much he loved the huge swap meet that takes place every fall in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Cruising down the freeway with the top down and his red 1961 Chevy Impala is the happiest I think I've ever seen him, besides being with his wife. And of course, he loved telling his jokes. It was genuinely impressive how many of them he had stored in his head. And these were long, complex jokes, too. There were certainly some that he had already told us many times, but every once in a while we'd hear a new one. Even if he told me a joke or a story we've already heard many times before, I always tried to listen and laugh as though it was my first time hearing it, because I could tell how happy and important those memories and stories were to him. His face would light up and he'd give us that classic Phil Lipton laugh that we all know and love. And I know for a fact I'll never forget him, as there will be so many moments in my life that will remind me of him. For example, I'll never again vacuum without thinking of him, because every time he'd see me doing it, he'd yell over to me, "Your vacuum cleaner sucks." There's so much more to say, appreciate, and reminisce about, but I'd be up here all day if I kept going. So he was the best grandpa I ever could have asked for, and we're certainly going to miss him immensely.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rebbe.
To ask of death that it never come is futile. But it is not futility to pray that when death does come for us, it may take us from a world one corner of which is a little better because we were there. When we die and people grieve for us, let it be because we touch their lives with beauty and love and simplicity. Let it not be said that life was good to us, but rather that we were good to life. That's how Phil lived. He was good to life. In turn, life was good to him and blessed him, as you've heard, with a wonderful and loving family. He taught his daughters, the grandchildren, and really all of us who knew him. He taught us about love and devotion and loyalty and commitment, not by talking about it, but by living it. With every action that he took, with every breath that he took, he taught us all those lessons. That's how he lived in the world. That's how he entered the world. That's how he lived in it for years and years and years. I will not repeat everything that we have heard already from the family, only to say that some of you may remember over the years letters to the editor at the Plain Dealer. When he wasn't happy about something, he didn't hesitate to write a letter. And Lori gave me something the other night. I'm not even sure what the purpose of this was. It's Phil's resume from 2004. but there's a couple of parts of it I want to read. And I think, if I got it right, I think Phil wrote most of this or said these things, and his daughters wrote it down, but then it circulated among them. I imagine several of you had some input into it, but some of it sounds like Phil's words. It indicates that he began working as an independent, as an apprentice to an independent mechanic when he was 14. Started this as an after-school job and on weekends. And then in 1949, he went to work for Reliable Oldsmobile, where he was until he entered the Army. He was a veteran, U.S. Army veteran of the Korean War, entered in 1952. And upon his return, after he finished the service, his return to civilian life, he went back to Reliable Olds as a used car salesman, but he says in the resume he didn't like doing that. So he went back to the mechanic side and the service side that he was more familiar with. But it's the very end. It's the last short paragraph, which he ends, "Thank you for your consideration." I think that's a funny way for Phil Lipton. I would never think of "thank you for your consideration." He should be given the consideration. Why should he have to be thanking people for that? But he wrote this. The rest of the resume highlights his career as a mechanic and working the service department, all the many classes he took. He could work on anything, but as I think all of you here know, he liked GM products particularly. And but he ends with this concluding paragraph: "I enjoyed teaching because my classes were mostly composed of professional mechanics who wanted to learn. And I felt that in sharing my knowledge and experience, I was contributing to their potential to earn a living, properly service the product, and build customer confidence." I love that. That's beautiful. He was held in extraordinarily high esteem by his fellow mechanics, those who were his peers and those who were his students, and he had many, many mechanics that he taught. I mentioned earlier he was a violin player, and I think that his musical ear was part of why he could diagnose what was wrong by the sound of a car, by the sound that the engine made. That's what he wanted to, he's, let me hear that. And he would figure out what it was. And if there was a particularly difficult problem that nobody in town could fix, GM corporate would send them to Phil. And if he couldn't fix it or figure out what was wrong, GM would buy the car back from that customer and give them the cash or replace the car. If Phil couldn't fix it, it wasn't fixable. As was mentioned, Phil changed his last name. It wasn't always Lipton. I think only some of you that are really old friends of his, going back a long, long time, will know that. It was Lipschutz was his last name, and I love this story. Phil and Millie got married, and Millie changed her name to Lipschutz, and I said, well, what prompted you to change it? I have a son and daughter-in-law who moved from America to Jerusalem, and they Hebraicized their name. When they got married, they gave up our family name, and she gave up her family name, and they chose a new Hebrew name that fit better for Israel. So I'm curious when people do that, and I said, what prompted the two of you a year or so after you got married to change your name? And it's a great answer. It tells you about Millie, but I think tells you more about Phil. She said, I had trouble pronouncing Lipschutz, and so we decided we would change it. And Phil he went along. If that's what Millie wanted, that's good. We'll change the name. You were ahead of you. Not many men were changing their name when they got married back in the early 50s. So that's a beautiful thing. From the author John Gunther. And I read this because it is so true about all of us who knew Phil, whether we knew him as an acquaintance, as a friend or a dear friend, or whether we knew him as a family member. The influence, the impact of a person continues to exert itself long after mortal bonds have broken. Not only that he lives in our hearts or in anything he truly touched, but that a person transmits permanently something of what he was to all of us. The fabric of the universe is continuous and eternal. Zecher Tzadik Livracha. The memory of this good and righteous man will forever be a blessing to all of you and to all of us who knew him and who loved him. Amen. If you are able to do so easily, please rise at this time. El Molei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina Im Kedoshim Utehorim Kizohar Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmato Feivel Wolf ben Moshe Shehalach le'olamo Began Eden Tehei Menuchato Ana Bal Harachamim Hastirehu Beseter Kanafecha Le'olamim Vayitzror Bitzro HaChayim Et Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato V'yanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkavo V'nomar Amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Feivel Wolf ben Moshe, to Philip Lipton, son of Morris and Jenny. He has now entered eternity. O God of mercy, we pray, may Phil find refuge in your eternal presence, and may his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance, and we say, Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Shiva for Phil will be observed after the burial service today. Shiva will be at the Lipton home, 5423 Gulfway Lane. It will be following the cemetery service until 8 p.m. tonight. And then Thursday, tomorrow, 3 to 8 p.m. Friday, 2 to 5 p.m. Shiva will resume Saturday evening from 5 to 8 p.m. and then conclude on Sunday in the afternoon from 2 to 6. If you drive to Shiva, there's plenty of on-street parking. If you come in an antique car, you can park in the driveway. For those who might wish to honor Phil's memory with a charitable contribution, the family suggests that you direct your generosity to the Jewish National Fund. Before we conclude here, we are going to honor Phil and his military service with military honors.
I could ask any of those who have been asked to be pallbearers would step forward, please. Line up 4 on each side. Right in place. Friends, I'm going to ask you to turn on your headlights. They will not turn on during the daylight. You can exit to the front of the chapel if you're on this, going with us to the cemetery. If you like, you can, if you're not, you can exit through the rear of the line, through the lobby. Thank you very much for your time.
See you Friday morning.